Hi, let me remove my shoes. I'm a tribal lady. It's good to be here. I want to take a moment because we're going to talk about the scars of trauma. Let's take a moment and visualize in our mind a tribal African person with those beautiful scars, right? We've seen it. Maybe you've been in Africa before, or you've seen it in National Geographic or somewhere, but those beautiful raised up keloids all over the body. Some tribes use those scars for aesthetic purposes, signs of beauty. Some tribes use that for protection or for medicine. Sometimes it denotes social status. But the Bafia people of Cameroon say that without their scarification, they are indistinguishable from the animals around them. All scars speak to strength, power, and endurance. Let's now shift and let's focus on a beautiful pregnant mama on delivery day. We see that big distended abdomen with all of those beautiful striations, right? Across the hips, on the belly, maybe on the breast. We can think of those as ugly and unsightly and something to be ashamed of, something that we want to hide or get rid of. Or we can think of them and as women wear them as the badge of honor necessary to bring forth new life. So perhaps all of our beautiful keloids and scars that are on our soul from trauma, perhaps they're meant to define our humanness, like the Bafia people. Perhaps they help us develop our resilience. What if they facilitate our spiritual attunement and evolution to bring forth new life within us? If we want to transcend those beautiful marks that can sometimes cause us some discomfort or pain, we have to mitigate the harm, leverage our strengths, and become joyful warriors. Now, for perhaps 14 generations, we are the cumulative expression of our ancestors. Well, that brings me joy, right? Because what I think about are my great-great-great-grandmothers that squatted in the cotton field, gave birth, wiped the baby off, put the baby on their back, and continued picking cotton. Because that strength is in me, right? Leverage the strengths. I think about those same great-great-grandmothers allowing the slave master's baby to suckle their breast for nourishment and attachment. And I have that same unconditional love reflecting in my own heart. I think about the ancestors that survived the Middle Passage, that hideous journey across the Atlantic, and I know that that resilience is also in me. But then I also have to think about my great-great-grandmothers when they were 9 and 10 years old and they become sexualized by the slave masters. I have to think about my great-great-grandmothers whose babies were ripped from them to sell them to another plantation. If I travel back 8 or 9 generations, and I think of one of my male ancestors in Dahomey during the slave trade, and there he is walking around, living in his day-to-day life, knowing that perhaps that net is going to be thrown over him and he's going to be dragged to a hideous new world. What happens when we live in fear? We move into living in a hyper state of hypervigilance, right? If I'm living my day-to-day life and I don't know if somebody's going to come and take me, I'm looking around all the time. I'm wondering, here, is it there? Is it going to happen today? Is the person here? Is the person there? When we move into that survival brain, we shut off the upstairs part of the brain that we need in order to learn and to have memory and to make good decisions and to have empathy and to be self-reflective and to do all of the higher functioning things. We lose our capacity to control our impulses. And once that happens, what we've learned from the cherry blossom study and from some other studies is that that potentially could stay that way for many generations. And when we live in fear, it impacts every part of us. It impacts how we think, how we feel, how we behave, how we emote, how we relate. So we also know that trauma is cumulative. So I could have a great-great-grandchild that walks into the classroom having carried trauma all the way from the ancestor on the motherland, year after year accumulating trauma. My great-great-great-grandchild could walk into the classroom and struggle to focus, because maybe they too are in that hyper state of hyper vigilance. Trauma, as we can see, however, is not new. The ancestors knew how to mitigate the harm, right? Regulate the brain. It was built into our day-to-day life. It was part of how we lived. Before we decided to prioritize capitalism over human beings, it was part of our day-to-day life. In 2011, I moved to India with my young son. He was 7 at the time. And we lived in an ashram in a very austere lifestyle. And the thing that scared me most, like I could sleep on the floor, I could have the big spiders that are this big, I could have no running water sometimes, I could do all the things, but what scared me was my 7-year-old's uniform that was white on Tuesdays, because I had to wash it by hand, right? But I would go to the rock, and I would bang the clothes on the rock, and I would take the scrubber, I would put it in the water soap bucket, scrub, bang the clothes, scrub the rock. Now, don't get me wrong, because I am no woo-woo lady that feels like doing a bunch of cleaning. But that became the most important part of my day. It was regulating my brain, right? The rhythm, the act of washing the clothes became a form of mindfulness and a form of meditation, which we had to do before we had the washing machine. You see, so we had opportunities all day long to regulate our brain. If we think about the women right now in Africa, many women are walking 5 miles a day, 7 miles a day, 10 miles a day to collect water. What's happening during that time? They're talking. They have relationship. They're socializing. And the very act of walking, being an optic flow, is neurologically regulating. Another opportunity to regulate the brain and manage the dysregulation of day-to-day life, toxic stress, trauma. Pre-COVID, I spoke at a conference in Flagstaff near the Apache tribe. During lunch, they brought in some Apache dancers, and they did this magnificent dance and sang this song. And I said, what was that? That was not entertainment. What was it? They told me that when the Apache would go out to war, when they came back, before they could rejoin their community, they did the dance. It was a debriefing. It was a neurological regulation. We had ritual and ceremony in order to help us once we exceeded our window of tolerance for stress. So what do? Well, science has finally caught up with our indigenous knowledge, and so our studies can prove that the ancestors had it right. We have to live collective. We have to live as a collective. We are wired for interconnection. We have to go back to living as collectivists instead of individualists. We have to reestablish our relationship with nature. 2022, I spoke at a conference in Kenya. We had all of these beautiful breakout sessions in the morning. In the afternoon, you could experience different healing modalities. I couldn't wait to get to the clay therapy. I was determined to learn clay therapy. So there I went with my Western brain, right? Because the West is always infiltrating us, right? I went with my Western brain ready to learn clay therapy. The clay therapy was working with your hands in the clay, in community. Because we don't heal trauma in the therapist's office. We heal trauma in our day-to-day interactions. We heal trauma in community. Healing is a communal event. So we have to work on our relationships with one another and our relationships with nature, because we are part of nature. We are at one with nature. We have to work on our movement, dance. Science shows us one of the most powerful things we can do is, guess what? Sing in community. Sing in community. Even if it's not in community, singing is one of the most powerful things we can do for the brain. It was not by mistake that during colonization, the first thing that was taken away from indigenous people was their right to commune and gather, dance together, sing together. That's part of the way we mitigate the harm, regulate the brain. Mindfulness and meditation, we integrate into our 21st century way of living. Adapted stress, like sauna and sweat lodge. And we have to remember that we think about colonization as a political process, but colonization is a social process. So in decolonizing the mind, we learn again how to have some of our indigenous practices that protects us and helps us to mitigate the harm. We are colonized not to respect our need for sleep. Sleep is another piece that we need. We have a great advantage when we have to overcome historical trauma, collective trauma, intergenerational trauma, because when we learn to regulate an overused stress response system, we develop our full expression of resilience. To transcend the scars of trauma, we mitigate the harm, regulate our brain, leverage our strengths. I am the best of what my ancestors were, and become joyful warriors. If no one has told you today, I love you. Thank you for your time and your attention. Ashe.